Grant Sterling thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought his ironclad prenup, his high-priced lawyers, and his hidden offshore accounts had left his ex-wife with nothing but the clothes on her back. He stood in his penthouse, champagne in hand, laughing as he watched her drive away in her father's rusted pickup truck. But Grant made one fatal calculation. He assumed his wife's silence was weakness, and he assumed her father was just a harmless, retired old man. He was wrong, and by the time he realized who he had actually declared war on, it was already too late to save himself. The champagne tasted like victory. It was a vintage Dom Perignon, chilled to the exact degree of perfection, much like the life Grant Sterling had curated for himself. He stood on the terrace of the Gilded Rail, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private clubs, overlooking the sprawling lights of the city. The wind whipped at his tailored Zegna suit, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the heat of triumph. "To freedom," Grant said, raising his glass. Standing next to him was Preston Hayes, his CFO and oldest friend from their Wharton days. Preston clinked his glass against Grant's with a smirk. "To freedom, and to the best legal defense money can buy." Grant laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Money? Preston, please. It wasn't just the money. It was the strategy. I played Caroline like a fiddle for 3 years. 3 years of moving assets. 3 years of bad investments that were actually just shell transfers to the Caymans. She walked out of that courtroom today, thinking she was lucky to get the Honda Civic." "You let her keep the car?" Preston asked, feigning shock. "You're a saint, Grant." "I am, aren't I? I also let her keep that rotting cabin her grandfather built up in Verify Lake Placid. The property taxes alone will bankrupt her within 6 months. It was a mercy kill." Grant took a long sip, savoring the burn. The divorce from Carolyn Mercer had been the talk of their social circle for months. Grant was the CEO of Sterling & Co., a boutique private equity firm that had been aggressively swallowing up mid-sized tech companies. Caroline, on the other hand, she was Caroline. Quiet, unassuming, a former librarian who had seemed dazzled by Grant's world when they met 5 years ago. He had married her because she was beautiful in a safe, domestic way, and because she looked good on his arm at galas without ever trying to overshadow him. But eventually, her silence became boring, her lack of ambition became irritating, and when he met Jessica, a shark in a skirt who worked in corporate law, he knew it was time to upgrade. "Did she cry?" Preston asked, leaning against the railing. "Not a tear," Grant said, shaking his head. "That's the thing about Caroline. She's numb. She just sat there while the judge read the settlement. No alimony, no claim to the marital home, no stock options, just a clean break. She signed the papers, looked at me, and said, 'I hope it's worth it, Grant.' Can you believe the audacity? She probably doesn't even understand what she lost," Preston mused. "She definitely doesn't. Her family. God, it's pathetic. Her father, Arthur. The man drives a truck that's older than I am. He wears flannel shirts to dinner. I think he was some sort of small-town accountant or clerk before he retired. He probably thinks a mutual fund is a charity organization." Grant chuckled, swirling his drink. "I was terrified he was going to try and audit me during the proceedings, but he just sat in the back of the courtroom reading a newspaper." "A newspaper? Who does that?" Grant turned back toward the interior of the club, where the music was thumping and the city's elite were mingling. He spotted Jessica across the room. She was wearing a red dress that looked like it had been poured onto her skin, holding court with a group of investors. "It's a new era, Preston," Grant said, his chest swelling with arrogance. "I've shed the dead weight. The portfolio is up 40% this quarter. The merger with Omnicorp is set to close next month, which will put me in the 9-figure bracket. I am untouchable. He truly believed it. He had constructed his life as a fortress. His money was shielded by layers of LLCs. His reputation was polished by high-end PR firms. His home was a penthouse that required a retinal scan to access. He looked at the city below and felt like a god looking down on ants. "What about the father?" Preston asked, a sudden note of caution in his voice. "You know what they say about the quiet ones." Grant waved his hand dismissively. "Arthur Mercer. Please. The man is a ghost. He lives in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. He spends his days feeding pigeons or whatever it is old, failed men do. He doesn't have the teeth to bite me, and he certainly doesn't have the reach." Grant drained his glass and set it on the railing with a definitive clink. "Let him rot in Queens with his daughter. I have an empire to run." The following morning, the headache behind Grant's eyes was a dull throb, a reminder of the 3 bottles of vintage champagne consumed the night before. But the hangover couldn't dampen his mood. Today was move-out day. He sat in the living room of the Tribeca penthouse, drinking an espresso, watching Carolyn tape up a cardboard box. She moved with an irritating efficiency. There was no screaming, no throwing of vases, just the rhythmic shrip-snap of packing tape. "You know," Grant said, not looking up from his tablet where he was checking the Nikkei index, "I could have had the movers do that, but I figured you'd want to handle your keepsakes personally. I wouldn't want them to accidentally throw away your collection of ceramic cats or whatever it is." Caroline paused. She was wearing jeans and a simple grey sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger than 32, but tired. "They aren't ceramic cats, Grant. They're first editions, and yes, I prefer to pack them myself." "Make sure you don't take anything on the restricted list," Grant warned, his voice cool. "The art on the walls stays. The espresso machine stays. The silverware stays." "I know the terms, Grant," she said softly. The elevator chimed, signaling a visitor. Grant frowned. The concierge usually called up. He walked to the foyer as the heavy steel doors slid open. Whatever he expected, it wasn't Arthur Mercer. Caroline's father stepped out of the elevator. He looked exactly as Grant had described him the night before. Unimposing. He wore a faded navy windbreaker, work boots that had seen better decades, and a baseball cap from a hardware store in Ohio. He was 65, perhaps, with grey stubble and eyes that were a washed-out blue. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like the guy you hired to fix a leaky sink. "Arthur," Grant said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Service entrance is around the back. This is the residence lift." Arthur ignored him. He walked past Grant as if he were a piece of furniture, stepping into the living room. "Ready, Carrie?" he asked his daughter. His voice was gravelly and low. "Almost, Dad," Caroline said, offering him a weak smile. "Just this last box." Grant followed him in, annoyed. "I didn't realize you were the moving crew, Arthur. I hope your back can handle it. I'd hate for you to throw something out and try to sue me for workers' comp. My lawyers are very aggressive." Arthur stopped and slowly turned to face Grant. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He scanned the apartment, his eyes lingering on the 10-foot Basquiat print, the Italian leather sofas, and finally resting on Grant. "Nice place," Arthur said. It sounded more like an observation of a crime scene than a compliment. "It's a $14 million place," Grant corrected him, puffing out his chest. "But I wouldn't expect you to understand the market. How is wherever it is you live? Queens?" "It's quiet," Arthur said. Arthur bent down and effortlessly lifted 2 heavy boxes of books, stacking them. He wasn't a large man, but he had that specific kind of wire strength that comes from a life of manual labor. Or so Grant assumed. "You treated her bad, Grant," Arthur said. He wasn't looking at Grant. He was adjusting the grip on the boxes. It was a statement of fact, devoid of emotion. "I treated her to a life of luxury she never deserved," Grant snapped. "And now she's going back to where she belongs. You should be thanking me. I kept her for 5 years. That's 5 years she didn't have to live on a pension budget." Caroline taped the final box. "Grant, stop it. We're leaving." "Good," Grant said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill. He walked over to Arthur and tucked the bill into the front pocket of the old man's windbreaker. "Here," Grant smirked, "for gas, and maybe buy yourself a new hat. That one is embarrassing." The room went deadly silent. Caroline's eyes widened in horror. "Grant, don't." Arthur looked down at the pocket where the money sat. Then he looked up at Grant. For a split second, the washed-out blue eyes seemed to darken, sharpening into something razor-edged. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Grant's arm stand up. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Arthur reached into his pocket, took the bill, and held it up. He studied Benjamin Franklin's face for a moment. "You keep this?" Arthur said, placing the bill gently on the marble coffee table. "You're going to need every penny soon." Grant laughed out loud. "Is that a threat? From you? What are you going to do, Arthur? Do my taxes incorrectly?" Arthur picked up the boxes. "I don't do taxes anymore, Grant. I solve problems." "And I'm a problem?" Arthur stopped at the elevator door. He didn't turn around. "No, you're a mistake, and mistakes get corrected." The elevator doors closed, taking Caroline and her father away. Grant stood alone in the silence of his massive, empty penthouse. He looked at the $100 bill on the table and scoffed. "Senile old bat," he muttered. He picked up his phone and dialed Jessica. "They're gone," he said, his voice lightening. "The apartment is ours. Come over. Let's celebrate properly." He had no idea that the mistake had just been logged, and the correction was already in motion. He didn't know that Arthur Mercer wasn't just a retired accountant. He didn't know that the name Mercer appeared on the deed of the land his office building stood on, or that Arthur had spent 30 years as a forensic liquidator for the federal government, a man whose job was to dismantle financial empires that thought they were too big to fail. Grant Sterling had just declared war on the man who wrote the rulebook on ruin. For the first 2 weeks following the departure of his ex-wife, Grant Sterling's life was a masterclass in excess. He didn't just live, he performed. Every dinner was a business acquisition, every drink was a toast to his own genius, and every night was a celebration of his newfound bachelorhood. Jessica had moved in with a speed that suggested she had been living out of a suitcase for months, waiting for the signal. She didn't just inhabit the penthouse, she colonized it. Caroline's soft, muted aesthetic, the beige linens, the watercolor landscapes, the antique wooden bookshelves, was systematically eradicated. It was so pedestrian, Jessica murmured one Tuesday evening, standing in the center of the living room. She was directing a crew of interior designers who were replacing the warm oak flooring with cold, severe Italian marble. Caroline had the taste of a librarian who won a lottery ticket. "We need something sharper. Something that says New York Power, not Connecticut Bed and Breakfast." Grant sat in his leather armchair, one of the few items that had survived the purge, swirling a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He watched Jessica command the room. She was efficient, brutal, and expensive. Everything he thought he wanted. "Rip it all out," Grant commanded. waving his hand at a built-in bookshelf Caroline's grandfather had hand-carved. "I want chrome, I want glass, I want nothing in this room that can rot." He took a sip of the scotch, enjoying the burning sensation in his chest. His phone buzzed on the armrest. It was Preston Hayes. "Grant, are you watching the tickers?" Preston's voice was breathless, tinny through the speaker. "I'm watching my living room get gutted, Preston. It's far more satisfying." "What is it?" Omnicorp. The stock just jumped 4 points in after-hours trading. The rumors of the acquisition leaked. The market loves it. We're going to be rich, Grant. I mean, island-buying rich. Grant smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "I told you. The timing was perfect. Caroline is out, the prenup is executed, and now the windfall comes in. If I had closed this deal a month ago, she might have had a claim to the appreciation. But now? It's all mine." "You timed the divorce around the merger," Preston said, half admiring, half terrified. "You cold-hearted son of a bitch. Strategy, Preston. It's just strategy. Listen, I have a meeting with the Omnicorp board on Thursday to finalize the signatures. Make sure the financials are spotless. I don't want a single decimal point out of place." "The books are cleaner than a monastery," Preston assured him. "By the way, did you get that notification from the bank? The Caymans account?" Grant frowned slightly. "What notification?" "Just a flag. A compliance review. Probably just an automated system update. I told the account manager to handle it, but I figured I'd mention it." "It's fine." Grant dismissed it, his eyes tracking a workman carrying out a box of Caroline's old vinyl records to the trash chute. Bureaucracy justifying its own existence. Ignore it. Focus on the merger. He hung up and walked over to the window. The city lights of Manhattan glittered below him. He felt an immense sense of distance from the world. He was up here, and everyone else was down there, including Arthur Mercer. Grant hadn't thought about the old man since the elevator doors closed. Why would he? Arthur was a blip, a non-entity, a man who thought $100 was a significant amount of money. Grant chuckled at the memory of the bill on the table. He had actually framed it, a cruel trophy sitting on his desk in the Home Office, a reminder of the price of dignity. "What are you smiling about?" Jessica asked, sliding her arm through his. She smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. "Just thinking about the food chain," Grant said softly, "and how good it feels to be at the top." The next morning, Grant arrived at the offices of Sterling and Cortas at 9 a.m. sharp. The office was a glass-walled shark tank in Midtown. His employees, 25 hungry analysts and associates, went silent as he walked in. That was how he liked it. Fear was a better motivator than loyalty. He walked into his corner office, threw his coat on the couch, and sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He logged into his terminal to check the Omnicorp projections. The screen flickered. A small grey dialog box appeared in the center of the monitor. "Access restricted. User authorization pending." Grant blinked. He typed his password again. "Access restricted. Please contact system administrator." "Janet!" he yelled. His executive assistant, a woman in her 40s who looked perpetually exhausted, rushed in. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" "Why am I locked out of the terminal? Did IT run an update without telling me?" Janet looked confused. I don't think so, sir. Everyone else is online. Let me call them." Grant tapped his fingers on the desk, irritated. It was a small thing, a technical glitch, but Grant Sterling hated small things that didn't work. He hated friction. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Janet returned, looking pale. "Mr. Sterling, it says it's not a system error. Your credentials have been suspended at the server level. They said the order came from legal." "Legal?" Grant laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "I am the owner of the firm. I am legal. Who in God's name suspended me? They said, it was an external compliance hold, triggered by a chaotic data request. Chaotic data request? What does that even mean? Grant stood up, his face flushing red. Get Preston in here. Now. When Preston arrived, he didn't look like the confident CFO who had toasted to freedom on the balcony. He looked sweaty. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Grant, Preston whispered. We have a problem. My computer is locked, Preston. Fix it. It's not just your computer. It's the Cayman accounts, the shell companies, the entire offshore network. Preston pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. I got a call from our contact in Georgetown at 4:00 a.m. He said a Level 5 inquiry hit the accounts. Grant stopped pacing. The room went very quiet. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roar. Level 5? Grant asked, his voice dropping. That's federal. That's terrorism financing. That's cartel money laundering. We don't do that, Preston. We skirt tax laws. We don't wash blood money. Why would we be flagged for Level 5? I don't know, Preston hissed, but whoever requested the freeze knew exactly where the bodies were buried. They didn't just freeze the main accounts, they froze the sub-accounts, the ones nested 3 layers deep in LLCs that don't even have your name on them, the ones we set up specifically to hide the Omnicorp buy-in capital. Grant felt a cold prickle of unease at the base of his spine. It wasn't fear yet, it was confusion. Those accounts were invisible. They were ghosts. Who? Grant demanded. Who has the clearance to do that? The SEC? The IRS? The notification didn't come from a standard agency, Preston said, his voice trembling. It came from a private contractor, a forensic liquidation firm acting on behalf of a blind trust. The code on the freeze was Old Iron. Old Iron? Grant scoffed. Sounds like a bad spy movie. Unfreeze it. Call our lawyers. Threaten to sue the bank into the Stone Age. I tried, Preston said. Our lawyer laughed at me. He said you don't sue a Level 5 freeze. You pray. Grant slammed his hand on the desk. I don't pray, Preston. I pay. Find out who is behind this. I have the Omnicorp signing in 48 hours. If that capital is frozen, the deal dies. And if the deal dies, we are leveraged to the hilt. Grant walked to the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned. For the first time in years, the view didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel exposed. Somewhere out there, a gear had turned. A lever had been pulled. And Grant Sterling, the man who prided himself on seeing every angle, had no idea he was already standing in the trap. The unraveling of a man's life rarely happens with an explosion. It usually begins with a silence. For Grant, the silence was his phone. By Wednesday morning, the day before the Omnicorp merger was scheduled to close, the constant stream of sycophantic text messages and congratulatory emails had dried up. It was as if the city could smell the blood in the water before the wound was even visible. Grant sat in his office, staring at a blank screen. The technical glitch hadn't been resolved. In fact, it had spread. His company email was bouncing outgoing messages. His access to the Bloomberg terminal was revoked. He was essentially a captain locked out of his own ship's bridge. Grant, Jessica's voice came from the doorway. She wasn't smiling today. She was wearing a sharp black suit, holding her tablet like a shield. My credit card was declined at Saks this morning. Grant didn't look up. He was rubbing his temples, trying to massage away a migraine that felt like a railroad spike. The banks are glitching, Jessica. Preston is handling it. It wasn't a glitch, Grant. The merchant code was insufficient funds. But that's impossible, because that card is linked to your primary holding account, the one with $8 million in liquid cash. She walked into the room and slammed the tablet on his desk. I called the private client line. Do you know what they told me? They said the account holder is under active audit review regarding marital asset concealment. Grant, what did you do? Grant's head snapped up. Marital asset concealment? That's absurd. The divorce is final. The judge signed the decree. Caroline signed the papers. It's over. Is it? Jessica narrowed her eyes. Because this looks like someone is reopening the discovery phase. If you hid money, Grant, and they find it now. I didn't hide it, Grant lied. He had hidden it. Millions of it. But he had hidden it well. This is a mistake. Probably Caroline's father trying to cause trouble with some nuisance complaint. I told you, he's a petty old man. A petty old man doesn't freeze an $8 million J.P. Morgan account, Jessica snapped. Fix this. I have a deposit due on the Hamptons rental by Friday. She stormed out. Grant felt a surge of hatred, not for her, but for the situation. He grabbed his coat. He needed air. He needed to get out of this glass cage. He decided to go to Le Bernardin for lunch. He needed to be seen. He needed to project stability. If the rumors started swirling that Sterling & Co. was having liquidity issues, the Omnicorp deal would implode before he even got to the table. He walked the few blocks to the restaurant, ignoring the cold wind. He entered the hallowed, quiet dining room, nodding to the maitre d'. Mr. Sterling, the maitre d' said, though his smile seemed tight, strained. We weren't expecting you today. I'm a creature of impulse, Henri. A table for one. The usual corner. He sat, ordering a bottle of wine he couldn't taste and a piece of fish he didn't want. He spent the meal pretending to read documents on his phone, though he was actually refreshing his banking app every 30 seconds. Account status, frozen. Account status, frozen. Account status, frozen. It was a sea of red text. Then he saw him. It happened so fast, Grant almost missed it. Through the sheer glass window of the restaurant that looked out onto the street, a black town car pulled up to the curb across the avenue. It wasn't a taxi, it was a government-issue sedan, the kind with tinted windows and heavy tires. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. It was Arthur Mercer. But it wasn't the Arthur from the penthouse. The flannel shirt and the baseball cap were gone. Arthur was wearing a charcoal wool coat that fit him with military precision. He wasn't hunched over. He was standing tall, reading a file folder as he walked. Grant blinked, leaning forward, his fork clattering onto his plate. Two men in suits, young, sharp, looking like federal agents, were waiting for Arthur on the sidewalk. They didn't treat him like a retired old man. They treated him like a general. One of them opened the door to the building Arthur was entering. Grant's eyes traveled up the building. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a law firm. It was the regional headquarters of the Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division. No, Grant whispered. That's impossible. He stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. He had to know. He had to confront him. He pulled out his wallet to pay the bill, terrified that his card would decline again. He threw $300 in cash, his emergency stash, onto the table and ran out of the restaurant. He sprinted across the avenue, dodging a taxi that honked aggressively. By the time he reached the other side, the heavy glass doors of the DOJ building were closing. Grant pushed through them, breathless, wild-eyed. The lobby was vast, cold, and imposing. Security guards stood at the turnstiles. "Hey!" Grant shouted, pointing at the elevators where the group was disappearing. "That man! The old man who just went up!" A security guard, a massive man with a bored expression, stepped in front of Grant. "Sir, step back. You need an appointment." "I know him!" Grant yelled, losing his composure. "That's my father-in-law. What is he doing here? Who is he meeting with?" The guard looked at Grant's expensive suit, his disheveled hair, the manic look in his eyes. "Sir, nobody went up who didn't have clearance. Step back or I will remove you." "He was with agents. I saw him." "Sir, the only person who went up in that lift was the Special Consultant for Asset Recovery. Now, exit the building." Special Consultant for Asset Recovery. The words hit Grant like a physical blow to the stomach. He stumbled back, the noise of the lobby fading into a high-pitched ring in his ears. "I don't do taxes anymore, Grant. I solve problems." Arthur's words from the apartment echoed in his mind. Grant turned and walked out of the building, dazed. He pulled out his phone and dialed Preston. "Preston," Grant said, his voice hollow. "Grant?" "Where are you?" "The CEO of Omnicorp is on the line. He says there's a hold on the escrow account. He's freaking out." "Preston," Grant said, staring at the grey facade of the DOJ building. "Google the name Arthur Mercer, combined with Department of Justice or Forensic Accounting. Do it now." "What? Why? Grant, we have bigger problems." "Do it!" Grant screamed into the phone, startling a passerby. There was silence on the line for a long 10 seconds. All Grant could hear was the frantic typing of a keyboard. Then Preston's breath hitched. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "Oh my God," Preston whispered. "What?" Grant demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What is it?" "Grant, the search results are mostly redacted, but there's a PDF from a congressional hearing in 2008, the financial crisis." "And?" "Arthur Mercer isn't an accountant," Preston read, his voice shaking. "He was the lead liquidator for the Iron Broom Initiative. Grant, he's the guy the government calls when they want to strip a corrupt company down to the studs. He's the guy who dismantled Enron's shell companies. They call him the Eraser." Grant felt the blood drain from his face. The world tilted on its axis. "He's retired," Grant stammered, trying to find a lifeline. "He drives a truck. He feeds pigeons." "It says here he officially retired 5 years ago," Preston continued, reading rapidly. "But he retains emeritus clearance to reactivate for cases involving—" "Oh, Jesus." "Involving what, Preston?" "Involving exploitation of vulnerable dependents and massive tax fraud." Grant dropped his hand to his side, the phone still connected. He hadn't just kicked a dog. He had kicked a wolf that had spent 30 years hunting things much, much bigger than Grant Sterling. And now, the wolf was awake. "Grant?" Preston's voice tinny from the phone at his hip. "Grant, are you there? The Omnicorp CEO is cancelling the meeting. Grant." Grant looked up at the sky. It was beginning to rain, a cold, grey New York drizzle. He realized then that the silence of the last 2 weeks hadn't been peace. It had been the time Arthur Mercer took to read the files, load the weapon, and aim. The first shot had been fired, and Grant was already bleeding. Thursday morning did not break with sunlight. It arrived in a shroud of suffocating grey fog that swallowed the tops of the skyscrapers. Inside the boardroom of Sterling & Co., the air was recycled, cool and thick with unspoken tension. Grant Sterling sat at the head of the long, polished table. He had spent the last 12 hours trying to reconstruct his facade. He had showered, shaved with a trembling hand, and donned his most expensive suit, a charcoal Tom Ford that usually made him feel invincible. Today, it felt like a costume. To his right sat Preston Hayes, who looked like a man walking to the gallows. Preston's eyes were bloodshot, darting nervously at every vibration of a phone. Across from them sat the delegation from Omnicorp, led by Aidan Vane. Vane was a silver-haired titan of industry, a man who had survived 3 recessions and viewed weakness as a contagion. He was tapping a gold fountain pen against his notebook. Tap, tap, tap. "Let's cut the pleasantries, Grant," Vane said, his voice a low rumble. My compliance team is telling me there's a hold on your escrow funds. They're telling me your liquidity is in question. I'm here to sign a merger, not a bailout. Explain. Grant forced a smile. It felt brittle, like it might crack his face. Aiden, it's a clerical error. A banking algorithm flagged a transfer because of the volume. We're talking about 9 figures moving across borders. It happens. I have Preston on the phone with the bank right now, clearing it up. He kicked Preston under the table. Preston jumped. Yes, Aiden, it's standard protocol. Within the hour, the funds will be released. Vane stopped tapping the pen. He looked at Grant with eyes like flint. You have 30 minutes, Grant. If that money isn't verified by 10:30 a.m., I walk. And if I walk, I'm taking the story to the Journal. The room fell into a heavy silence. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than physically possible. Grant's palms were slick with sweat. He needed a miracle. He needed a lie that would hold for just one more day. Then, the heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom swung open. It wasn't the secretary with coffee. Arthur Mercer walked in. He was flanked by 3 men and 2 women. They weren't police officers. They were terrifyingly nondescript. They wore ill-fitting suits and carried briefcases that looked heavy. They were the auditors, the forensic dissection team. Arthur held a thick, black binder under his arm. He walked with a calm, terrifying purpose, ignoring Grant entirely, and walked straight to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "Who the hell are you?" Vane demanded, standing up. "This is a closed meeting." Arthur placed the black binder on the table. The sound it made, a heavy, dull thud, echoed in the room. "My name is Arthur Mercer," he said, his voice level. "I am the court-appointed special master regarding the asset forfeiture of Sterling & Co." Grant stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "Get out! You have no authority here. Security." "Security has been relieved of duty," Arthur said, not even looking at Grant. He opened the binder. "Mr. Vane, I suggest you sit down. Unless you want Omnicorp to be named as a co-conspirator in a federal RICO indictment." Vane slowly sat down. His face went pale. "RICO? What are you talking about?" "Grant Sterling didn't just hide money from his wife," Arthur said, flipping a page. "He used your acquisition capital to plug a hole in a Ponzi scheme he's been running via shell companies in the Caymans. He was leveraging your money to pay off previous investors before the merger closed." "That's a lie!" Grant screamed. He looked at Preston. "Tell them it's a lie, Preston." Preston didn't speak. He was staring at the table, tears leaking from his eyes. "Preston has already cooperated," Arthur said softly. "He cut a deal at 6 a.m. this morning." Grant froze. He looked at his best friend. Preston wouldn't look at him. "I'm sorry, Grant," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "They had the emails. They had the wire transfers. They had everything. I couldn't go to prison for you." Grant felt the floor sway beneath him. The betrayal was total. Arthur slid a single sheet of paper down the long table. It stopped perfectly in front of Aiden Vane. "This is the summary of liabilities," Arthur said. "Sterling & Co. is insolvent. The assets Grant claimed to have, they don't exist. They are leveraged 3 times over." Vane read the paper. His hands began to shake. He looked up at Grant with a mixture of disgust and pity. "You tried to play me," Vane said quietly. "You tried to use my company to launder your debt." "Aiden, listen," Grant started, reaching out a hand. Vane stood up. "Don't come near me. The deal is dead, and my lawyers will be in touch about the breach of contract fees." The Omnicorp team packed up their things in record time. Within 2 minutes, the room was empty, save for Grant, Preston, Arthur, and the team of auditors. Grant slumped into his chair. He felt hollowed out. The silence returned, but now it wasn't tense. It was final. Arthur stood up and walked slowly down the length of the table until he stood next to Grant. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. "I told you, Grant," Arthur said. "I don't do taxes. I correct mistakes." Grant looked up, his eyes burning with tears of rage and humiliation. "You ruined me." "Over what? A pickup truck? $100 bill?" Arthur shook his head. "You ruined yourself. I just turned on the lights." Arthur signaled to one of the auditors. "Change the locks. Escort Mr. Sterling from the building. He is not to touch a computer or remove a single piece of paper." "This is my building," Grant whispered, though the fight was gone. "Not anymore," Arthur said. "It belongs to the creditors now, and eventually to Caroline." Arthur turned and walked out, the black binder tucked under his arm, leaving Grant Sterling sitting alone at the head of a table that no longer commanded any power. The walk out of the building was a blur. Grant vaguely remembered the security guard, a new one he didn't recognize, taking his building pass. He remembered the stares of the receptionists as he was led through the lobby like a criminal. He hailed a taxi. His driver, his car, his life. It was all seized. When he arrived at the Tribeca penthouse, it was late afternoon. The sky had turned a bruised purple. He just wanted to sleep. He wanted to close his eyes and wake up 5 years ago. He keyed in the code to the front door. It beeped red. "Access denied." Panic flared in his chest. "No," he muttered. "Not here. You can't take this yet." The door opened from the inside. It was Jessica. She was standing there, but she wasn't greeting him. She was surrounded by 3 Louis Vuitton suitcases. She was wearing her coat, her sunglasses perched on her head. "Jessica." Grant stepped inside. The apartment looked strange. It was stripped. The art was gone. The chrome sculptures were gone. "I heard," she said. Her voice was cold, sharp as a scalpel. "It's all over Twitter. Sterling and Co.'s raided. Fraud allegations. Insolvency." It's a misunderstanding," Grant lied, the habit dying hard. "I'm going to fix it." "Stop it," she snapped. "Preston's wife called me. She told me everything. You're broke, Grant. You're worse than broke. You're radioactive." She zipped up the final bag. "Where are you going?" Grant asked, his voice trembling. "I'm going to a hotel, and then I'm going to verify my own assets to make sure you didn't drag me down with you." She looked at him with a sneer. "I signed up for the yacht, Grant. I didn't sign up for visiting hours at a federal penitentiary." "I did this for us," Grant yelled, desperation clawing at his throat. "I tried to build an empire for us." "You did it for your ego," Jessica corrected him. "And you failed." She brushed past him, her suitcase wheels rumbling loudly on the marble floor, the cold, hard marble that Grant had insisted on installing. At the door, she paused. "By the way, the landlord called. Apparently, the lease was held by the company. You have 48 hours to vacate." The door clicked shut. Grant was alone. He walked into the living room. It was cavernous and dark. The furniture that remained looked like islands in a dark sea. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall where the Basquiat used to hang. He pulled out his phone. He had 4% battery left. He scrolled through his contacts. Not Preston. Not Jessica. Not his lawyer, who wasn't answering. His thumb hovered over a name. Caroline. He didn't know why he dialed it. Maybe he wanted to scream at her. Maybe he wanted to beg. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, calm. It sounded like a warm blanket. "Caroline," Grant croaked. "Grant," she said. There was no malice in her voice, just a sad recognition. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you know what your father was?" I knew he was good at his job, Caroline said gently. I tried to warn you, Grant. I told you to just let us leave. I told you not to push him. He destroyed me, Caroline. I have nothing. You have what you started with, she said. Actually, you have less. Because when we met, you at least had your integrity. You traded that away a long time ago. I can fix this, Grant whispered, tears streaming down his face. I can settle, It's over, Grant, she said. Dad isn't doing this for revenge. He's doing it because it's the law. You broke the law. You hurt people. You hurt me. I never wanted to hurt you, he lied. You wanted to erase me, Caroline said, her voice firming up. You wanted to wipe me out like a line item on a spreadsheet. You just didn't realize that my father is the one who holds the eraser. Caroline, please, goodbye, Grant. The line went dead. Grant let the phone drop from his hand. It clattered onto the marble floor. The room grew darker as the sun set. Grant looked around the penthouse. He had spent millions renovating it to look powerful, to look intimidating. Now, in the twilight, it just looked cold. He remembered the cabin in Lake Placid, the one he had mocked. He remembered Carolyn describing the fireplace, the smell of pine, the worn rugs. He had called it rotting. Now he realized it was the only place in the world that was warm, and he wasn't welcome there. He curled up on the hard floor, pulling his suit jacket tight around him. The heating had been turned off remotely. The cold was creeping in. He was the smartest man in the room. But now, there was no room left. There was only the consequences of his own arrogance, closing in like the night. 6 months later, the courtroom smelled of lemon polish and stale anxiety. It was a stark contrast to the filtered air of the gilded rail or the sterile luxury of the penthouse. This was the Southern District of New York, courtroom 14B, and the air here tasted like consequences. Grant Sterling stood before the bench. He was 30 pounds lighter than he had been the night he toasted to his freedom. His hair, once styled with $50 clay, was thinning and graying at the temples. He wasn't wearing a Zegna suit. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit issued by the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The press gallery was full. The fall of Sterling & Co.'s had been the financial scandal of the year. The headlines had been brutal. The Sterling scam, from penthouse to prison, and, most cutting of all, the man who bet against his wife and lost. Judge Vance peered down over his spectacles. Mr. Sterling, you have pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of perjury regarding the concealment of marital assets. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Grant gripped the wooden podium. His knuckles were white. He looked back at the gallery. He saw the faces of the investors he had defrauded. He saw Preston Hayes, who had taken a plea deal for 18 months in a minimum security camp in exchange for testifying against Grant. Preston looked down, unable to meet his eyes, and in the back row, sitting quietly, were Caroline and Arthur. Caroline looked radiant. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She was wearing a thick wool sweater and jeans. Her hair was loose. She looked healthy, rested, and entirely free. Arthur sat next to her. He was wearing the same flannel shirt, the same faded windbreaker, and holding the same baseball cap in his lap. He didn't look angry. He didn't look happy. He just looked like a man who had finished a job. Grant's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I just wanted to win. I thought that was the point. The judge shook his head slowly. The point, Mr. Sterling, is that society functions on trust. You violated that trust at every turn. You viewed people as assets to be liquidated. You are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, Restitution is set at $22 million. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. As the marshals moved to cuff Grant, he turned desperate eyes toward the back of the room. "Caroline!" She didn't flinch. She simply watched him. "Arthur!" Grant yelled, the panic finally breaking through his numbness. "Arthur, tell them I can pay it back. I can consult. I know the markets." Arthur stood up slowly. He put his hat on. He walked to the wooden rail separating the gallery from the defendant. "You don't know the markets, Grant," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "You knew how to cheat, and now the audit is closed." "You planned this," Grant spat, the bitterness surging one last time. "You waited." "I didn't wait," Arthur corrected him. "I observed. You bragged about freedom, Grant. Now you have 8 years to think about what that word actually means." The marshals pulled Grant away. As he was dragged through the side door, the last thing he saw was Arthur placing a protective hand on Caroline's shoulder and guiding her out into the sunlight. Two weeks later, the snow was falling softly on the pines surrounding Lake Placid. The cabin wasn't rotting. It was alive. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm, orange glow over the room. The smell of cedar and roasting coffee filled the air. Caroline sat in the oversized armchair, a book in her lap. It was a first edition she had bought back from the government auction of Grant's seized assets. In a twist of poetic justice, the restitution payments from Grant's frozen offshore accounts, the very money he had tried to hide, had been awarded to her. She wasn't rich in the way Grant had wanted to be, but the mortgage on the cabin was paid, the roof was fixed, and she had enough to live simply for the rest of her life without ever having to ask anyone for permission to buy a coffee. Arthur was in the kitchen, fixing a hinge on the back door. He tested it. Squeak. He oiled it. Silence. "Better," he muttered. He walked into the living room and poured himself a mug of coffee. He sat on the rug near the fire, stretching out his legs. "You know," Caroline said, closing her book, "I got a letter from him today." Arthur blew on his coffee. "Grant?" "Yes. He's at Fort Dix. He asked if I could send him some money for the commissary. He said the food is terrible." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "I imagine it is." "He also asked for his $100 bill back, the one he gave you." Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out his old leather wallet. Tucked inside, behind a photo of Caroline's mother, was the crisp $100 bill Grant had thrown on the table that day in the penthouse. Arthur looked at it. "He thinks this is money," Arthur said softly. "He still doesn't get it." "What are you going to do with it?" Caroline asked. Arthur stood up and walked to the fireplace. The flames were dancing, hungry and bright. "It's not money, Carrie," Arthur said. "It's a receipt for the lesson that arrogance is the most expensive luxury in the world." He tossed the bill into the fire. They watched as Benjamin Franklin's face curled, blackened, and turned to ash, floating up the chimney into the cold night air. "There," Arthur said, dusting off his hands. "Now the books are balanced." Caroline smiled. She looked out the window at the frozen lake, vast and white and peaceful. She finally understood what her father had known all along. Real power wasn't about penthouses or mergers or hiding millions in the Caymans. Real power was the ability to sit by a fire with a clean conscience and a warm home and fear no one at the door. She took a sip of her coffee. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. "Any time, kid," Arthur said, picking up the newspaper. "Any time." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, everything was warm, everything was paid for, and everything was finally, truly free. Grant Sterling spent the next 8 years in a 6-by-8 cell, surrounded by men who didn't care about his portfolio or his tailored suits. He had spent his life building a fortress of money to keep the world out, only to realize that he had locked himself in. He underestimated the two things that actually matter: the quiet strength of family and the dangerous competence of a man with nothing left to prove. Arthur Mercer proved that you don't need to shout to be heard, and you don't need a penthouse to be powerful. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one quietly reading the newspaper in the back. Grant thought he had won the divorce, but in the end, he lost the only thing that actually mattered: his freedom. What a ride. It just goes to show that you should never judge a book by its cover, or a father-in-law by his pickup truck. Grant learned the hard way that arrogance comes before the fall. What did you think of Arthur's revenge? Was it justice, or was it too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma, revenge, and twisted justice, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.